Hello, friends, comrades, and interested others. I'm back with another video. It is Thursday, and I'm gonna try to get to a point where I'm making a video once a week, which I'm telling you now to try to pressure me to actually do it. They will most likely be coming out on either Tuesdays or Thursdays, given that this video was supposed to come out on Tuesday, and it is now Thursday. So I thought I'd try out a makeup thing today. Let me know what you think. Do you like it? What do you think it means about the configuration of my genitals? Let me know in the comments down below. So jumping right into it, today's video topic is going to be gender. Like all of my videos on these very general topics, this will be a very overly simplified, insufficient explanation of this that is very limited to my subjective experience and things that I've read, conversations that I've had, ideas I've been exposed to, so I really encourage people who want to engage with any of the topics I discuss in my videos to go out and do further research and seek other voices on these things, because I'm only speaking from my own experience and ideas. So, the word gender. When people say gender, what they are referring to is the psychological, social, and cultural phenomenon of how people engage with masculinity and femininity. Now, that sounds like a lot, but basically what that means is when people say gender, they're not talking about the biology of it, they're talking about how people dress, how people behave, how they talk, how they identify and relate to themselves, how they engage in relationships, how they engage in labor. They're talking about the anthropological implications of that phenomenon that is related to sex. So I feel like having that working definition of when people say gender, they mean the psychological, social, and cultural aspects, makes it a lot easier for you to understand what people are talking about when transgender issues are being discussed. So a lot of internet trolls will go around saying that your gender is whether you have a penis or a vagina, and it's that not only doesn't make you look smart, but that actually makes you look specifically incompetent, that you're not able to engage in the topic that's actually being discussed because you don't understand what the topic that's being discussed is. So if you're going to be engaging in conversations about transgender and gender issues, please understand that gender means psychological, social, cultural phenomenon. Okay, so with that with that working definition, moving on. So with that understanding, it also becomes inherently fallacious to say that there are only two genders, because to say that there are only two genders is to say that there are only two ways of both internally and externally relating to and engaging with gender, which there just factually aren't. Because if there was only two genders, there would only be two ways of dressing, two ways of speaking, two different things for you to call yourself, the cultural and historical differences between how gender is expressed wouldn't exist. It just completely falls apart once you're working with that definition. And so when you're talking about the social phenomenon that is gender, it becomes immediately apparent that, of course it's a social construct, because you're talking about a social phenomenon. It's inherently socially constructed, as all of the things that we do socially are. And it also becomes immediately apparent that gender is fundamentally diverse, because the ways that people express their gender, the ways that people experience attraction, the ways that people's bodies are, the way people talk, everything about the way that people engage with all these different aspects of what social, cultural, psychological gender is, all of those aspects can be brought into spectrums, and everyone falls in a different place on their expression and how they relate to themselves and how they perform and what jobs they do and how they fit into different roles. Hell, just put me up next to some hypermasculine cis dude and tell him that we express masculinity in the same way, and I'm sure he'd be thrilled to hear about it. But we don't. No matter how much it might comfort you, and no matter how much one might insist on putting people into categories of sameness, it just doesn't follow through when you're actually observing the world around you and how those things function. Science is the art of observing, recording, understanding, and predicting the world around us, not determining it. If science had the ability to control how the universe and nature worked, we'd be living in a very different world. So just by the fact that there are unlimited ways of people to dress and speak and relate to themselves and each other, and to identify themselves to others, and people do identify their genders in unique ways, and people do get gender-affirming surgeries with high rates of satisfaction, just the fact that there are people out there doing those things, most of the time in spite of being heavily discouraged, proves the validity of gender in the eyes of science. And if you'll go to any university medical library, you'll find tens of thousands of articles and research studies that have been written on the topic. So please, internet transphobes, stop screaming short lists of genitals and proposing that science just isn't there yet on transgender issues, because I assure you, the science is there, you're just not there because you either don't understand the science or you haven't been bothered to look it up. But let's get back to the sex aspect, because that's always the thing that people want to talk about. I get people who are like, okay, so I understand that gender is the psychological and social aspects of it, but what about sex? Like, what about the immutable biology of it, the hard science that's underlying all of it, that you can't just, like, identify your way out of? It would be a simpler world if that were true, but biology and science actually don't work like that. Biology is incredibly various, and genetic diversity is the reason why we have evolution. It's important to remember that even science doesn't exist in a cultural vacuum. While the scientific method is ideally seen as objective, the people who are conducting scientific research and proposing hypotheses and determining what concepts should be investigated are still people who are still living in a society and whose ideas and beliefs are still influenced by the ideas and beliefs of the society that they live in. For much of Western history, there has been so much violent prejudice towards gender variance ingrained in our culture that people have, for the most part, had to take it as a given that gender and sex were deterministic and binary categories. And for many people, forcing themselves to fit into these socially constructed binary categories has been extremely damaging, and resulted in, like, lifelong depression, suicide, other mental health issues, addiction. The enforcement of gender as a binary and biologically deterministic concept has been overall a pretty terrifying phenomenon throughout history, that not only in its impact on transgender and gender variant people, but even on its impact of the freedom of expression of cisgender people and all people about how they would like to dress, how they would like to present themselves, the types of jobs they would like to have. So the discussion of gender equality and gender liberation is really one fundamental to universal human emancipation and, like, freedom, equality, and liberty for all people. So yeah, these categories that were pretty much created and enforced by governments and religious and social institutions have not actually been researched formally or extensively until very recently. However, formal research into the psychological and social aspects of gender and transgenderism actually isn't as recent as a lot of people think. The term transsexuality was actually founded at the Institute of Sexual Science in Berlin in the 1920s, and that institution was actually making major headway towards research in understanding transgenderism and sexual orientation and all of these other concepts before the Nazis took over Germany and burned everything. I will save my thoughts and feelings on the potential for a neo-fascist resurgence to completely compromise all transgender progress and research over the past 40 years for another video. But we are back at a point now where we are researching gender and sex and sexual development, and the conclusions that we are coming to pretty much across the board is that a lot of these concepts that we have constructed and been abiding by for all of this time throughout our history have actually not been based on, like, they actually don't hold up under the scientific method, and in fact many of them are harmful to people. So it's actually very important for us to understand, like, the science and understand the research that's being done here and kind of embrace that and go with that, because there's many things that we've done for long periods of time that we have realized that there was no good reason for us to be doing, that maybe were even actually harmful, that we had to stop doing. And we're finding with that research that even sex, like even the biology of it, is not as categorical as we've made it to be. Culture informs science as much as science informs culture. So by putting these categories onto biology, we have kind of just assumed that they existed and assumed that they were somehow justified, and then when looking at it realized, oh, we actually were pretending that things had to be a way that they didn't have to be, and things are a lot more complicated, and people are a lot more similar than we thought that they were. So for example, a lot of people say, like, oh, but you'll have different health problems, like a transgender person and a cisgender person will have different health problems because there's, like, you know, bone density and blood pressure and other, like, health variances that are determined by a person's biological sex, and the assumption is that your biology would stay the same and you would still have the health issues associated with your assigned gender for your whole life, when actually a lot of transgender people are intersex, so a lot of transgender people don't necessarily have the chromosomal, hormonal, physical makeup that you're assuming that they have, and even if they do or did at one point, the influence of hormones and sex reassignment surgery on a person's body completely changes a person's physiology, including bone density, including muscle density, including like what your sweat smells like, and the density of your body tissue, and like pretty much everything, to the point where someone who's been on hormones for years has a lot more in common insofar as like health risks and predispositions to a cisgender person of the same gender than they do to a cisgender person of the gender that they were assigned. Like, they actually wind up having very little similarity to people of the gender that they were assigned. So even biology is definitely something that is influenced and changes over the course of your life. So basically, as far as the biology of it goes, in the most layman's terms I can possibly explain it, yes, there are people who have penises and there are people who have vaginas. And people who have penises have a typical set of anatomy that they are born with, among which there are infinite variations. People with vaginas have a typical set of anatomy that they are born with that also have infinite variations. Between those two, there is also infinite variations, although they are statistically less common than, you know, the common alignments of you have a vagina and a uterus and ovaries and estrogen, or you have a penis and testes and testosterone and will eventually grow facial hair. There's so much variation within those two categories, and there is infinite variation between those two categories. It's just kind of like two bell curves, and that's kind of how that science works. Fact check me. I know that there are people in the comments being like, citations needed, and I'm just like, fact check me. Like, I know that's how it works. I've had to explain this to my doctor, it's fine. So yeah, sex, based on an observable biological trend, but this looks a lot different than this. You know what I mean? So like, just because it's based on an observable biological trend does not mean the boxes that we have then constructed around that natural phenomenon are valid or are the best way of thinking about those things. And so you may be thinking, okay, so much of this is at least kind of fake. Why are we doing it? Like, why did we construct these boxes? Why did we say, like, if you have a vagina, you like flowers, and if you... Fine. Well, like many things in this late capitalist hellscape, it mostly comes down to labor and the exploitation thereof. So a lot of how gender has been constructed and about how gender power dynamics have played out throughout different cultures and throughout history has been about which groups of people are doing which types of labor. And even in many cultures, the way that they determined gender was a lot more about what type of labor that you did than it was about the biological aspect of it. So while it may have been expected that if you were a person who was born with a vagina, then you would do a certain type of labor, if you weren't a person who was born with a vagina but you still wanted to do that type of labor, then congratulations, that's, you know, that's who you are, that's what you're doing, that's fine. And that's still kind of present in our society, like when you think about why it's degrading for a man to be a secretary, or why it's, you know, seen as some big deal for a woman to be a CEO, like that's a good thing to be, but whatever. But the fact that gender is still enforced through what type of labor you're expected to do and how your labor is valued. Feminine labor tends to be seen as domestic, and domestic labor tends to be seen as feminine. So that is labor done within the home, or labor done like in the service of other people, especially under the direct supervision of a man. Which is why like cooking, cleaning, like sewing, fashion, like that kind of stuff is all seen as women's work until it gets to the upper professional level where, you know, you're a chef or you're a fashion designer, or you actually have like industrial influence in those things, then that's a man's job. But the devaluing of feminine labor allows for the exploitation of their labor at like little or no compensation. So much of domestic labor that happens in the home, like raising children, cooking, cleaning, doing all these things, is uncompensated labor. And even when domestic type services are provided in a professional context, it's not super well compensated. And so yeah, a lot of these social oppression dynamics come down to how one group has exploited the labor or profited off the labor of another group historically, and how that affects labor relations in the present day. feel like I kind of swam all over the place in this video a little bit and kind of touched on a bunch of different topics about gender, but if there's anything that you feel like I completely left out or any other topics that you'd like me to discuss, you can totally let me know. Honestly, gender is one of my favorite things to talk about, so I'm hoping to be able to make some more videos about that kind of tied into the more political themes I've been wanting to discuss recently. I also just wanted to say that I recently started a Patreon at patreon.com/circleatattoo. So if you're more financially stable than me and would like to help fund the therapy sessions that the comment section of this video is inevitably going to necessitate, please consider donating. I hope to see you again soon, and have a nice day. Peace out.